Hello, my name's Kieran Harvey, and I'd like to talk to you today about my research project, which is entitled The Thematic Relationship Between the Blues, Classical Music, Heavy Metal, and the Emergence of the 1980s Guitar Virtuosos, which can be found within the movie Crossroads. In 1986, a relatively unknown guitarist, except amongst the guitar community, was cast to play the role as the Devil's guitarist in a film that was to be centred on the blues and was to present a modern twist on the mythology and legend tied to the late Robert Johnson. In blues mythology, Johnson sold his soul to the devil after heading down to the crossroads to make a deal to become a famous blues guitarist. The name of the film was Crossroads, and the musician cast to play the devil's guitarist was Steve Vai, whose performance as Jack Butler during the cutting-edge duel at the film's climax becoming a pivotal role of inspiration in many guitarists' lives, and up to now receiving over 40 million views on YouTube alone. Directed by Walter Hill in 1986 and aimed at a primarily adolescent or teenage market, Crossroads is a fairly typical rite-of-passage movie with an oedipedal trajectory of that era, but looking at it on a deeper level, serious questions of philosophical theology, ethics, various theoretical models such as authenticity, the juxtaposition and interaction of different music styles, geography, hermeneutics, semiotics, and the age-old dichotomy presented by two infinities, music as the good versus the music as the bad. I intend to look at the emergence of the 80s guitar virtuosos through its thematic relationship between the blues, classical music and heavy metal music, which can all be found in this movie and Steve Vai's performance. Crossroads is centred around Eugene Martone, a classically trained guitarist whose real passion is for blues music, and who is obsessed with searching for the lost song of the late Robert Johnson, a famous blues guitarist legend who was said to have sold his soul to the devil in return for musical mastery. But with the idea of finding and recording this song to become a legend in his own right, Eugene enlists the help of Willie Brown, a harmonica player who Johnson talks about in his songs. Brown convinces Eugene to take him with him on his journey so he can get his own soul back, which he himself sold to the devil years before. Throughout this journey, Eugene comes face to face with the grim truths about life, which his blues heroes had used for inspiration, and when Willie informs him that there is no Lost Johnson song for him to record, he makes it clear to Eugene that the means to artistic success of a real bluesman is not in the inauthentic coverage of someone else's materials, but in giving musical expression to his own authentic experiences and hardship and suffering. For the return of Willie's soul, Eugene offers to duel with the devil's guitarist, Jack Butler, played by Steve Vai. But when Eugene faces Butler in the duel for both he and Willie's soul, it is not as you would think his new-found blues understanding that beats Butler. He is no match for Butler's modern display of guitar pyrotechnics. It was in fact his own musical roots and skills as a classical guitar protege that floors Butler. When he plays a piece based by the Devil's violinist Niccolo Paganini's Caprice No. 5, this iconic head-cutting duel scene was written and performed by Steve Vai, but originally this scene was set to see the musical director Ry Cooder play Jack Butler, and in not fact Steve Vai. But the producers were keen on capitalising on the mid-80s guitar shred boom, with Ry Cooder looking for someone better than Van Halen. Steve Vai was cast and was quickly able to put his own stamp on the part. During his performance, Steve Vai portrays the stereotypical heavy metal guitarist, brooding, long hair, tight leather trousers and a cynical attitude, much the same way as Paganini, the Devil's violinist, dressed in black, wore his hair long and went around in black coaches pulled by black horses to help forge supernatural associations. Robert Johnson was said to have sold his soul in exchange for musical virtuosity. After his transformation from a stumbling novice to an accomplished master of blues guitar in a relatively short time, and with his song lyrics and mysterious death, this rumour became a legend. But the propagation of the devil at the crossroads myth serves a greater purpose by hyping up or trumpeting the skills and virtuosity of the performer. This supernatural assistance has helped countless musicians like Johnson and classical musicians like Paganini and Liszt in keeping the hype around the name, and even for Steve Vai, as his stint as the Devil's guitarist has put his name on the tongues of all guitar worshipping fans in the mid-1980s to the present, and with people still referring him to the Devil's guitarist. This Crossroads legend seems to be a variation of the European story of Faust, a 500-year-old folklore about a German alchemist who was said to have sold his soul to the devil for knowledge and power. But it also shares its traits with earlier West African. Most versions of the Crossroads stories involve an aspiring musician to go down to the crossroads with their instrument and await a limping old black man who will tune and play the instrument before handing it back and bestowing it with supernatural powers. This limping devil is actually Legba, a West African hoodoo who limps because he is in a liminal space, with 1 foot in the visible world and 1 foot in the realm of the spirits, with the crossroads being the place where these worlds meet. Blues musicians are often referred to as liminal figures and children of Legba because they stand at the crossroads with their feet in different cultures. Scholars suggest that liminality is the blurring and crossing of thresholds and boundaries, the breakdown of historical fixed categories, the exposure of ambiguities, and the fluidity and hybridity of identities. Much like Eugene in the film with the blending of his two cultures, and with the heavy metal being the blend of disenfranchised African American society and the social climate in the late 60s Britain. Liminality can be seen throughout the birth of many musical styles. But it's not just blues that has connections with the supernatural and the devil. The classical virtuosos not only possessed unusual technical facilities, but through music were able to command extraordinary, almost supernatural rhetorical powers. Robert Schumann reported a performance by Liszt was like watching a demon flexing its muscles, and he was unable to ensnare everyone that watched him, as if by magic. Paganini, a formidable string instrument virtuoso, also spent his life surrounded by rumours about owing his gifts to the devil, and, like Johnson, was not the source of the rumour, but very much aware of it and reacted ambivalently to it, privately deprecating the rumour to his friends, yet simultaneously fostering a public image of the demonic violinist as an effective publicity that could ensure commercial gain. But recently scholars asserted that Paganini's technical feats were not preternatural, particularly when compared to modern virtuosos, but rather were perceived so because of their innovative qualities. Attributing Paganini's and other musicians' remarkable abilities to supernatural sources is just a way to explain how these virtuosos made difficulties of technique and execution vanish, and just reflected the viewer's helplessness and possible jealousy by those unwilling to put in the time, in which Kawabata also agrees with. Either by choice or by chance, casting rock heavy metal guitarist Steve Vai as the Devil's guitarist also opens up discussions between the thematic relationship between heavy metal music, the blues, classical music, and the emergence of the 1980s guitar virtuosos. Although Satanism has long been associated with the blues and classical music, so has heavy metal music with its devil horns, hand gestures, and song lyrics and album covers having satanic or dark supernatural themes. But the relationship between these musical genres is more than just its dark associations. Black blues artists began to tour Europe in the 50s and gained critical acclaim from what was to be the first significant white audiences, with British musicians hunting down the works of the original blues artists like Johnson. From this, the first guitar heroes emerged with the likes of Eric Clapton, Jeff Beck and Jimmy Page, who submerged themselves into learning about the blues musicians and the history surrounding the music, with Clapton idolising anything to do with Robert Johnson, performing several of his tracks with his band Cream. These new guitar heroes mixed rock and roll from Chuck Berry and the deep blues of Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf to create British blues. The next big thing that fueled the British blues boom was the arrival of Jimi Hendrix to the country. His original guitar techniques and musical virtuosity brought in a new way of playing traditional blues standards, and with songs like Voodoo Child kept up the association with the devil. Inspired by the likes of Hendrix and Clapton, the late 1960s rock bands developed a musical language that used distortion, heavy drum beats and sheer loudness to create a sound more powerful than groups before them. This also coincided with a flourishing interest in the occult, with horror films emerging and becoming popular amongst cinema audiences. A member of the Polka Dot Blues band suggested, "Isn't it strange that people pay money to see scary films? Perhaps we should start writing scary music." The film was Black Sabbath, which led to the band using the same name and ushering in a darker sound that became synonymous with heavy metal. The harmonic progressions, vocal lines and guitar improvisations of metal all rely heavily on the pentatonic scales derived from blues music. But from the very beginning of heavy metal there has been another important influence: classical music. Throughout heavy metal's history, its most influential musicians have been guitar players who have also studied classical music. In 1969, guitarist Ritchie Blackmore joined the line of Deep Purple. Blackmore's appropriation and adaptation of classical models enhanced the harmonic and melodic vocabulary of the genre. Adding this into the blues rock's mix sparked the development of a new kind of virtuosity, with new modes of musical pedagogy and analysis becoming common practice. But in an interview in 1973, Blackmore accepted that there were limitations that guitarists had compared to pianists who could play 10 times faster. These limitations were pushed aside in 1978 with the arrival of Edward Van Halen, who redefined virtuosity in the electric guitar. Van Halen dutifully practiced Mozart on the piano when his dad encouraged him to learn classical music, until his interest in guitar prevailed, and like most rock guitarists, Van Halen was heavily influenced by the blues, mainly by the guitar playing of Eric Clapton. But along with the influence of the blues, Van Halen's classical piano training taught him music theory that would later prove useful. In 1978, Van Halen released Eruption, which had an enormous impact on rock guitar playing. Eruption shows exuberant and playful virtuosity, a violinist's precise and showy technique inflected by the vocal rhetoric of the blues and rock and roll. Here and everywhere, Van Halen's guitar playing displays an unprecedented fluidity due to his skillful use of string bending, two-handed tapping and his deft touch on the vibrato. In Eruption, we can see some of the first uses of classical technique in modern rock guitar, utilising cliché Chuck Berry-inspired bends directly into a quotation of the best-known cliché of violin pedagogy, an etude by Rudolf Kruser. But rather than playing it straight, Van Halen tremolo picks each note 3 to 4 times, showcasing his classical technique, before introducing an F natural, changing the mode from Kreuzer's major to a darker Phrygian mode. But one of the most innovative techniques used by Van Halen in Eruption was two-hand tapping. This was a genuine expansion of the instrument's capabilities and the most important technical innovation since Jimi Hendrix. Van Halen's development of two-handed techniques for the guitar might be compared to J.S. Bach's innovations in keyboard fingering. Two-handed tapping allowed for arpeggios to be played with triads, supercharging and outlining slow harmonic changes as used by classical musicians like Vivaldi, and throughout Eruption, Van Halen, like Vivaldi, reiterates the power and the importance of individuality, showing that this is the prerogative of a virtuoso. We can see here in the final Crossroads duel, Eugene's Trick Bag, written by Steve Vai, how he uses parts from the 24 Caprices written by Paganini, and demonstrating perfectly why this section is perfect for the guitar trope of that era. A writer for the leading professional guitar magazine says flatly the single most important development in rock guitar in the 1980s has been the turn to classical music for interpretation and form. The recordings of Van Halen, Randy Rhoads, among others, signalled a rise in the technical standards of rock guitar playing that prompted many new players to seek out classical organised study. Institutional support for such technical study grew as well, with classical guitar teachers appearing on college faculties. The Guitar Institute of Technology and Music Tech in Minneapolis incorporated a rock syllabus where all guitarists were required to study classical guitar and jazz. This new breed of guitarists adopted the classical model of rigorous practice and pedagogy, stressor, rationalization, and technical rigor, which was ascendant throughout the 1980s. Steve Vai's practice habits also date back to his classical training and conservatory experience, and was taught classical music orchestration from a very early age, which he continued later at Berklee College of Music. Here he focused on jazz and big band orchestration, and famously sent transcriptions to Frank Zappa of his own very complex tracks, which landed him a job with Zappa and ultimately forged his own style and virtuosity. Back in 1700, Johann Kahuna wrote a piece suggesting that virtuosos must not only have a full understanding of musical theory but perform at the height of artistic practice. This describes Van Halen, Malmsteen and Vai perfectly, with their ability not only to play uniquely but to entertain and captivate audiences with their performance. Virtuosos function socially, as they allow the listener to be part of and engage in their performances. They're able to communicate their own thoughts and feelings, with guitarists like Jimi Hendrix being able to, through music, express that which simply could not be communicated any other way. Some might find virtuosos inherently distancing, elitist or supernatural, since it is a sensational display of exceptional individual power. But for many others, virtuosos are the most effective articulators of a variety of social fantasies and musical pleasures. Wolf Marshall compared metal guitarists to Liszt and Paganini in their virtuosity, bravura manner, mystique, attractiveness for women, and experimentation with flashy crowd-pleasing tricks. By adopting the piano to become more responsive to every impulse of hand and foot and brain, Franz Liszt made it become musical's central vehicle for heroic individualism. Paganini's willingness to experiment and modify both his violin and traditional classical technique, coupled with his extraordinary physical flexibility, enabled him to manipulate the instrument like no other before him. And just as advancements in instruments helped the classical musicians in the development of their techniques, so did it for Van Halen. With his style very dependent on high-gain amplification and sophisticated distortion circuitry to help with the sustain, Van Halen himself was involved in experimenting with amplifiers and guitar modification to help develop this hot sound. And it was this evolution of the construction of the electric guitar that helped create the leap in virtuoso's abilities between Hendrix and Van Halen, with companies like Ibanez taking care of the new breed of guitar virtuosos with the Floyd Rose tremolo system, which allowed for stability in extreme bending and whammy bar techniques. Van Halen ushered in a new era of virtuosity amongst the rock and metal genre, but the trend came to full fruition in the early 1980s with the arrival of the Swedish guitarist Yngwie Malmsteen, who was inspired by Paganini, Bach and Vivaldi, as well as Jimi Hendrix and Ritchie Blackmore. This era then became synonymous with highly developed guitarists with high levels of music knowledge and music education. The Crossroads movie encompasses perfectly the creation of the 1980s guitar virtuoso, from its blues beginnings and associations with the devil to its rock and subsequent classical injections. Barker suggested It is in fact quite peculiar that classical music, from whose performance and aesthetics Eugene has fled throughout the film, should provide the douce machina that saves their souls. But from my perspective, it fits perfectly with that 1980s virtuistic guitar model. Perhaps a more fitting way to conclude this film would have been to celebrate this joining of musical styles. This reintegration of both his musical sides could have created a sense of Dionysian liminality that the message in the film tries to create. After all, heavy metal and the subsequent 80s guitar heroes could all be linked back to those early blues guitarists and their associations with the devil that inspired the British blues guitarists to study and evolve their playing styles, and in turn inspiring classical trained musicians like Van Halen to add these skills to the blues rock mix, and the 80s shred guitar virtuosos like Steve Vai. Blues, like all music, is about finding your own voice, and this is actually what Eugene is doing here, which is how virtuosos are created. The film seems to miss this opportunity to relay this message, and it could come across as a more highbrow European or American culture music versus lowbrow African American music. But in reality, these two music styles and the subsequent blend of them is the reason for heavy metal music, and the high level of guitar virtuosity displayed from the guitarists in these bands in the 1980s. A writer for the leading professional guitar magazine says flatly that the single most important development in rock guitar in the 80s is the turn to classical music for inspiration. This is why the producers of the Crossroads movie were so keen on jumping on the 80s guitar boom and adding one of their up-and-coming stars in Steve Vai. In the Crossroads movie, liminal spaces are everywhere. From the blues, classical crossover, to the purgatory stage of the duel, and of course the crossroads themselves. These blurring of lines and crossing of thresholds and boundaries seem to be where virtuosos come from, suggesting that liminality is an important factor in creating new music, with virtuosos having the creativity and skill to dip their toes in different musical influences, styles and equipment. Steve Vai himself does not consider himself a virtuoso, but just tries to challenge himself to stay curious and keep on pushing his own limits further. Schwartz writes that Paganini was not afraid to break the rules of classical violin technique. This seems to be the case with other virtuosos of his time, as well as the guitar virtuosos of the 60s to the 80s. All virtuosos seem to have the ability to motivate themselves to practice and seek out ways to advance their skills, with Steve Vai well known for his 7-hour guitar practice sessions. The early blues musicians' virtuosity can also be explained in the same way. There was no supernatural deal, like with classical musicians, but perhaps just rumours often told by other musicians unwilling to spend the hours of time and effort needed to obtain this level of virtuosity. Certainly, the blurring of the cultures of these musicians would have played a part as well. On one side, the West African gods, and Christianity on the other, with blues being in the liminal space between, like Jesus and the Devil, Sunday morning and Saturday night, and Sanctity and Sin. Thank you very much for listening.